In this video, I will be demonstrating swatching for knitting in the round. If you're a subscriber, welcome back. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. When you swatch for gauge, it's important that you use the same knitting technique in your gauge swatch that you will be using in your project. So this holds true for knitting in the round. If your project is going to be knit in the round, you should work your gauge swatch knit in the round, or mimicking knitting in the round. So there are a few ways you can work your gauge swatch to get an accurate gauge measurement for knitting in the round. The green yarn is maybe a little dark here, but I have a swatch that I am working for a gauge swatch for a colorwork pattern. One way you can mimic knitting in the round for a smaller gauge swatch is to use circular needles or double-pointed needles and strand the yarn across the back loosely. So to do this, you loosely strand the yarn across the back. And then you begin working and this happens to be color work, but this holds true for any knitting pattern, stitch pattern. And then you slide your stitches to the other side of the cable to begin working from right to left again, and you loosely strand your yarn across the back. Make sure you strand them loose so that you can still block your swatch nice and flat. Now the first several stitches and the last several stitches will be loose and wonky, so when you measure for gauge, don't include those stitches. This swatch is a little too small for an accurate gauge swatch. You want your swatch to be at least 4 inches of measurable knitting. Ideally larger. The larger the better, the more accurate number you can get. So make sure these are loose enough so that when you block this, it can stretch. If you do not want to cut these strands, if you're planning on reusing this yarn at all, then make them loose enough so you don't have to cut them. Another option for mimicking knitting in the round is to use this method, but cut your yarn at the end and rejoin at the beginning, leaving very short tails. You will not be able to reuse your yarn from the gauge swatch with that method. Another way is to use this method where you strand across the back, but then cut all of these strands after you've blocked them and open it up. Another way of mimicking knitting in the round for a gauge swatch is to actually work your gauge swatch in the round. I would advise making your swatch at least 6 inches in circumference. And then you you cut open your knitting at the back and lie it flat while blocking. You will have raw edges, however, at the 2 sides of your swatch. Again, you will not be able to reuse that yarn, and you may need to secure the edges with a crocheted steek securing method before cutting. An issue with that method is you are you're substituting a smaller circumference knitting in the round for a larger circumference knitting in the round. So say your sweater is being knit in the round and you work a 6-inch knitted in the round gauge swatch. Well, your gauge might change from knitting a 6-inch circumference in the round to knitting a 40-inch circumference in the round. So do keep that in mind. Another option for gauge for knitting in the round, if you're not too concerned about needing to possibly rip out your knitting, you can simply begin knitting a sleeve or a smaller circumference piece of the garment that you are making. And then check your gauge as you get several inches of this sleeve knitted. You may want to put the sleeve stitches on a stitch holder or waste yarn and then block the sleeve and check your blocked gauge. But if your gauge is close, then you can just continue knitting along. If it's not close, however, you will need to rip out and start over. So I typically don't do this method, but if you find your gauge knitting on smaller circumference differs greatly from your project in the round knitting, then this may be an option for you. You could always work a much larger in the round gauge swatch and don't cut it open. So work something like an 8 or a 10-inch circumference piece and block it flat. Don't cut it open and measure. You will still have a 4 to 5-inch width that you can measure, but it's not as small of a circumference. And then you can unravel your gauge swatch and reuse that yarn if you really need to. So those are a few suggestions for swatching for knitting in the round. I hope this was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.